There we go. We've got Nate today who's going to be talking about agile prototyping best practices over at LookThink. I will pass this over to him.
Thanks, Jerry. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Agile Prototyping Best Practices. Before we get started, I want to say thanks again to Jerry and the team at UXPin for giving me the opportunity to talk with you all today. Also want to thank you guys all for being here. This is a really neat thing that UXPin is doing with this summit, and I'm excited and honored to be presenting. So I hope you can all walk away from this presentation with at least a little something to take back to your teams to help you with your prototyping practices. So a little about me. My name is Nate Janisi, and I'm a senior information architect at LookThink. My background is in visual design and marketing. I've been designing and building interfaces for a little over 10 years now, and the majority of that time has been with LookThink. LookThink is a full-service user experience agency based in Washington, D.C., and we focus on B2B enterprise product design. We have a wide array of clients that vary from your next-door neighbor startup to agencies in the U.S. government. So the scope and the scale of our projects is all over the place. On any given day, we'll be working on anything from a small-scale application to enterprise-level cloud-based software implementations, Salesforce customizations, B2B websites, e-commerce solutions, etc. So we see a lot of different stuff. These types of projects provide us with a broad spectrum of budgets, complexities, timelines to deal with, and we often jump into projects at varying steps along the process. So sometimes we come in at the very beginning, sometimes we just come in for the design part of it, sometimes we come in at the end to triage and run damage control, and because of that, we've seen really a wide variety of scopes and situations and problems and things that we've used and learned from to help drive our process. And since no two projects are the same for us, we've really had to work to find commonalities across projects that can help us be efficient and agile. And it's not always easy. Often a solution that worked for one client does not work for another. There's always new personalities at play. So since we're not an in-house shop and we don't really start at the same place in every project, it's hard to implement a solidly structured process that works across the board, right? So however, we've had a lot of success with some of our prototyping practices, and that's the part that I'm here to share with you today. So hopefully these practices can hopefully be adopted or adapted by your organization. But the goal is to help you try to move towards a more agile design process with faster approvals, natural collaboration, smoother developer handoff, and ultimately I hope some of these ideas make your lives easier. Again, these processes are processes that work for our team, given the style and the type of work that we have. So they may not work wholesale in your work environment, but hopefully you can adjust and adapt them accordingly to fit your own team's style. So let's talk about how we got here. In the past, we delivered static wireframes for our applications and websites, either in a PDF or printed format. The wireframes were complex, comprehensive. They went into extreme detail, full of thoughtful analysis and information architecture, and people wouldn't get it. We'd spend hours, days, weeks, months on wireframes, and ultimately people did not follow or understand. They tended to be confused. Overall, we had a great deliverable, but they lacked the clarity that the client needed to really follow what we were doing. Our hard work was really going unnoticed and unappreciated. We were creating great business solutions, solving difficult information architecture challenges, providing awesomely thought out user experiences, and the clients weren't noticing. We wound up having to document the wireframes so heavily to explain them that we were damn near doubling our effort at times. And once we documented, people wouldn't read it. And I see this and I cringe because I wouldn't want to read this either. So we wound up having to go through these documents again and again and practically read the documentation to the client to get them to understand. So once the development team got them, it was a whole new process that we had to figure out, right? So at one point we were actually pasting screenshots of the application into a 187-page Word document and using track changes to make sure we were catching the requirements. It was ludicrous. A lot of this got alleviated when we started using Jira eventually, but because of that lack of clarity at the beginning, the feedback was scattered and unfocused. People were completely missing the actual business and experience problems that we were solving for. Not to mention it was killing our timelines before we got to the development phase. So all along the way, our really awesome information architecture and user experience solutions were getting lost in the shuffle, and it was a pretty defeating process for us. I remember one time working on what I thought was a fairly straightforward search and display type flow for a healthcare reporting organization, about 14 wireframes, a couple of flows, and a handful of standalone pages. And we laid out the experience in a static PDF format with wireframes. And we went into the first meeting. It was basically, okay, you click here, you go here, you see this, you click here, you see this. It was something I thought would have been very fairly easy to follow. And I was very, very wrong. The first meeting took forever. The second meeting, we had to go back over what the first meeting covered. The same with the third. They couldn't imagine how things would link to other pages. They couldn't keep track of flows from one page to another. Every time we sent something out for them to analyze it, they'd come back with more new and dumb questions. But the thing is that they weren't really dumb questions. They genuinely did not understand, and they were genuinely confused. Our whole job as information architects and designers is to clarify information for people. And we weren't doing our job of clarifying that communication with the client and the deliverables that we were presenting to them. So while we were confident in the clarity of the product itself and its overall outcome, there were so many other steps along the way that needed clarity before we got there. So we realized that we were losing the fight, not to our work, but to the static wireframe as a deliverable. So what do we do to rectify this? How do we get away from that using static wireframes? We committed to codeless prototyping as our method of agile delivery. In the course of a month, we stopped static wireframing altogether and made a company-wide commitment to, in this case, UXPin as our prototyping tool of choice, and our main delivery method of pretty much everything moving forward. We embraced that any of that initial upfront investment of creating a prototype would be saved in time and confusion throughout the rest of the process. So now everything that we deliver prior to development gets delivered in UXPin. And why? Because in short, it creates clarity for all parties involved. It adds clarity to the process that was missing from those static wireframes. And we'll talk more about some of these points later, but I can tell you that the first project that we tested out this prototyping on was the phase 2 of that previously mentioned project. And we had some good ideas for how to contextual ways of moving the user from one section of the site to another. And given the previous debacle, I knew that we had to try something different. So we committed to putting that into a prototype. Excuse me. We got the flows in, we put some basic content, we linked everything up. And the next meeting we had, I ran through those flows with them and showed them everything on a screen share in UXPin and sent them the link and let them click around. And by the end of that hour-long conversation, they had the whole thing approved. So the previous static wireframe took weeks to get people on board. This one took an hour. That time savings in this case was multiple hundreds of %. And more importantly, we now had time to figure out other better experiences and other things, business solutions for this client. And when you're working on a fixed price project, this is a big deal. Those extra bits of time add up, and those extra little nuggets that you can throw in there add value, and that's what keeps clients coming back. And the better you get at it, the quicker you start to demonstrate real value for your clients in a short period of time. In addition to the client clarity, it's opened up a new world of clarity with both our own development team and other development teams that we work with. Prototypes have now become our acceptance criteria and requirements documentation. Developers now understand how their work fits into the entire product as a whole because they can see everything instead of just the pieces that are assigned to them as tasks. And I know that many of you are prototyping already, which is great. There's probably a handful of people out there who are not, and for anyone who isn't yet, I can tell you that the transition to dumping static wireframes has some challenges. But overall, it was much more painless than one might expect. So as you make that move from whatever you're doing into prototyping, here are a few things to consider. There will be a learning curve with the technology. It's like learning Photoshop or Sketch. It'll take a little while, but will soon be second nature. But account for the fact that you won't know how to do some things right from the get-go. And 2, don't panic when you feel like you're spending way more time on things up front. In reality, you probably are. There's no doubt that creating even the simplest of wireframes, the simplest of prototypes takes way longer than creating the same number of pages as a static wireframe, but we'll talk about the benefits later on. The timelines for deliverables will be a little different throughout the project. What may have taken 6 hours to static wireframe may take 8 to do as a prototype. In the later stages of a project, when you get into some of the more complex prototypes, you'll basically be doing development without code, and there's a level of testing that kind of needs to be baked into that time-wise. And then just accept the fact that there will be things that you can't demonstrate. So some functionality is just not worth the effort to build into a prototyping tool, and it's okay to fake it. You'd be surprised how even a rough facsimile can get the same point across. So how do we incorporate prototypes into our process? Pretty much everywhere and in every way. The information architects are creating them and sending them off to the client. The client is commenting on them and sending them back to the information architects. The information architects are sharing them with the designers to get them involved in what is coming. The information architects are sending them to the developers to gut check feasibility. The devs are sending them amongst each other to discuss their approach. And all of that is getting turned into code that goes to QA to check against the prototype. And then ultimately to the client for review, and then eventually going live. So they play a major role in our day-to-day life. So with all that being said, let's get down to brass tacks and talk about what we've learned and what has been successful. So best practice number 1, prototype in chunks, depth versus breadth. So to stay agile, obviously we try to eliminate big design effort up front, but we have to keep track of the experience as a whole to make sure there aren't big gaps that come back to bite us later. So how do we reconcile depth versus breadth? Everything for me starts on paper. Call me old-fashioned, but I'm a firm believer in it. I sketch my pages out, I number them, I put arrows, I put question marks, I put links to the numbers, I put stuff like see page 4. And I think through the entire experience from end to end, from a flow perspective, based on the goals of the product, I write out those major flows in words and boxes. I make sure I don't have any gaps. I go into a room and I start shuffling papers around and pretending I'm clicking. It looks ridiculous, but I do it and it works. It's informal. It keeps me from getting too caught up in the details. And I usually do this whole paper process until I'm starting to think about what those links should say or what the right icon is, things like that. And at that point, it means I'm at a detailed enough point to stop sketching and move on to prototyping on screen. So these manic and messy sketches get translated to UXPin and linked up to build the very first basic version of the prototype. Simple boxes with some text, some buttons, some links. And this helps us identify anything that we may have missed during the sketching phase. We can identify holes in the application where we may need answers. And also now, because we can actually click through the prototype, we can identify any rabbit holes and any seemingly simple actions that may require additional actions or flows. So an example of this is on an existing project that we're working on. We have a very large application we're working on where the product owner wanted to add some workflow functionality. And as we started to think about building out the task assignment piece to this puzzle, it started out simple. It was a link to assign a task, a modal to see who it assigned to, and then the assignee would receive a message in the app. But we realized that while that was an okay experience, it really was missing some critical elements. There was a lot to think about surrounding that simple action. We realized that we needed a place to view those tasks you've sent, the tasks you've received. We realized that there were certain permission issues with regards to who could send tasks to whom. What if I don't know how to solve my assigned task? Can I refuse it? Can I assign it to someone else? What happens if I do those things? Are there deadlines associated with tasks? So while all of those things didn't need to be ready for the first release, by being able to click through a prototype, we were able to recognize that we weren't even quite at an MVP for this feature, and we left it alone to focus on more pressing features. So if we'd had just sent those tasks to developers for those links to assign, a dropdown for a modal, an alert to assignee, we would have built a pretty subpar and potentially frustrating experience for the users. So when we finally got around to estimating that piece, it turned out to be about 100 hours of discovery to hash it all out. So by working through that very small piece early, we were able to recognize that it was a huge, huge effort. So once we have that simple box and flow version, we can zoom in at certain points in the application and prototype out particular widgets or chunks of the product for features in the upcoming sprint. And while we're working on these now zoomed in individual features, we can always refer back to the experience prototype to make sure that we don't get tunnel vision. So what you're seeing now on the screen is that after testing the lo-fi version of each chunk, we'll increase the interactive fidelity and then hand that off to development and design. And this way we're designing and developing in smaller increments. So you can also break out individual widgets into their own pages. Sometimes the prototypes start to get a little too complex to manage on one page. So we've started breaking things out and putting them on their own pages and kind of linking to them from the page that contains it. When you do this, you need to take extra care, though, to make sure that everyone can follow along, since the pieces are now pulled out of the main app. So what I tend to do is put my UXPin pages in with a Jira ticket for the number of the ticket that we're working on, so that the devs can find them easily, and then we know what we're looking at 6 months later. Sometimes it's better to link out to interactions that you think are useful or that you'd like to use. So for example, you don't have to spend time building something. You can just say, I'd like to use a dropdown similar to this, and people can look at that and get a sense of what you're trying to do, right? So at each point along this path, from the wide to the narrow, we're getting feedback from clients and developers. And this way our breadth, our vision, as well as our depth of individual features are always aligned across the whole team. People have a sense of where things fit into the bigger picture. And obviously that previously mentioned Jira ticket naming convention allows you to link then directly to a Jira ticket to reference the flow that corresponds to. So practice number 2, prioritize your cases for prototyping. So if you go back in time to our simple boxes and labels prototype, before we start working on individual widgets, we have our end-to-end flow, and we know that we have all of our steps accounted for, our scenarios covered, our decision points noted, but we don't have any serious interactions. So how do we decide what to actually prototype first? There's always a few indicators that we use to help determine what to begin prototyping first. For us, it's a bit of a dance between a few things. Again, because we work with various product owners, and it's always kind of a different algorithm of importance. But almost as important as the experience itself is being able to sell it to the stakeholders. So when determining what to prototype first, keep a few things in mind. Has the client expressed any confusion or concern over a particular piece of functionality? If so, focus on that. You'll have a much happier and pleasant client stakeholder after they've seen it and understand it. So having that client or stakeholder confused about something or hung up on a piece of functionality, that's a surefire way to add hours to a project. What are the highest value targets? So what pieces of the application, if done wrong, would cause the most confusion? What is the weakest link? Is there anything that could stop the user in their tracks and keep them from continuing? If so, it's worth spending extra time on that to get it absolutely right. So if you're building the photo sharing app, it's worth testing and iterating many times to be sure that users can easily upload photos before you go figure out the settings section. So build out and validate those interactions in the photo portion before moving on to the rest of the app. What are the most complex interactions? Can I demonstrate them by linking to interactions on another site? We saw this a little earlier. If I can demonstrate them from another site, I may be able to save a lot of time for more important things. So for instance, if you found a great drop-down menu here, you can know it's going to take you 3 hours to build a UXPin, but it may take you 10 minutes to build a link to it to say, hey, check this out, and let's get sign off on this before we hand that to developers. And then handing that to the developers, they will have a sense of what you're trying to build. So then what pieces are using commonly accepted UI patterns? What are we copying from elsewhere? Do you really need to lay out the login screen first? If you're using a pretty standard practices and patterns, you can probably save some of those pieces for later. If it's not anything particularly novel, you can probably wait on it. You can still show it in the flow so it feels complete, but keep it simple. And then what parts of the product have we not figured out yet? So when you're prioritizing things, obviously, if you don't know it, you can't prototype it. So save those for last until you can fill in the blanks. I find it important to put placeholders in the prototype just to note that there's no content. Blank boxes with content goes here, even if it's just one big block on a page so that the user can get to that, whoever you're testing with can get to that page and then bounce off of it, helps kind of keep the flow in check. You don't wind up abandoned. Practice number 3 is pacing your fidelity. So fidelity for us actually means a couple of different things. There's interactive fidelity and design fidelity. Interactive fidelity is how true to form is the prototype to what we'll actually deliver. And design fidelity is how close it looks to the actual layout from a design perspective. Generally, the earlier in the sprint, the lower both the interactive fidelity and the design fidelity. You want to resist the temptation to go for that wow factor just yet. There's a time and a place for that. I'll explain shortly. But we talked earlier about just translating boxes and links from a paper drawing into lo-fi version. Your lo-fi version has a couple of benefits. It acts as a sitemap, a 10,000 foot view. It's low interactions, it's buttons, it's a couple of links, it's boxes and images, blank images, maybe some drop downs if they're critical to navigation, some simple modals, just the basics that allow you to go through the app. It's a low investment. It's probably a day or two for a simple site and then maybe a week or so for a very complex application. And it helps you find holes in your requirements. What errors and missing states did you uncover? It's better to learn this earlier rather than in sprint 10. So if you remember the example of the workflow, we were really happy to have had that figured out early on rather than 10 weeks into the development cycle. Your lo-fi, however, does not mean that you should fake your content. You could get away with lorem ipsum and lo-fi, but it's better if possible to use real content, even if it's rough. Content is the heart of the design. If you have the resources, a copywriter or a content strategist should be part of your Scrum team. But I always tell my team that if we don't have final content, they should put rough content into the app, even if they have to make some of it up and even if it's not perfect. I encourage it for a couple of reasons. One, you get better at writing for the web and applications the more you do it. Two, it helps you understand the product better because you have to think about what you're writing and what users are going to be reading and consuming. And then three, the best way to get content from a client is to put the wrong content in there. One of the biggest things that delays projects for us is waiting for content from clients. So this gives the client something to react to, and 8 times out of 10, they will leave what you've written for them. And trust me, if they don't like it, they'll replace it, and it gets you there faster. If they don't like it, at least gives you a jumping off point. So why is the real content and data so important? The more realistic the content, the better that designers, devs, and stakeholders can understand the full scope of the system. Not to mention your whole design might break if you drop content and data in as an afterthought. So it also prevents mental disconnects and confusion, unfocused stakeholders. If a set of numbers in their app is supposed to add up to 100% and you've got 5 numbers at 65%, then that person looking at your prototype is going to be confused. They're going to wonder why it's not adding up, right? So sometimes in the early stages, that can be hard to get right, but you should do your best to get real data when you can. And then once you've shown and tested your prototype in this lo-fi state with simple interactions, then you can dive into the hi-fi and start digging into some of the micro interactions and testing those. So for our design fidelity, we never really design our functional prototype as it moves from interactive lo-fi to hi-fi. We try to keep a level of polish on all of our prototypes, and we'll talk about how UI kits can help keep that polish. But these functional prototypes never sit in for the actual design. They are kept completely separate. We're slowly working towards some more design in UXPin as they release new features that help facilitate that. And I think they just released something today for the design systems. But what we do more often than not is to have the designs moving on a parallel track in Sketch, and then we put the designs back into UXPin for review. Then the designers link up the pages and it starts to look like a real website. So clients can see their product coming together from a visual perspective. So in the hi-fi design prototype, we actually start to pull back some of the functionality. There's no need to build in the kind of logic and complexity into a new prototype. So we use simple toggles and fades and some new images for states and menus just over top of other images. So it's much faster to edit and update. Since the client has already seen the interactions and the functional prototype, there's less confusion about what they're actually looking at, and they're just excited to see the design come to life. So best practice number 4 is annotating your user flows. The ideal state is that your prototype becomes the documentation. With complex enterprise products, you will probably most definitely not eliminate all documentation, but you will certainly reduce the quantity and the pain of document maintenance, as well as increase the overall comprehension of the app. We like to use the documentation section to write our user flows right next to the prototype in a sort of how do I get through this format. It allows the user and developers and the clients to follow a user's path through the interactions on the screen. So the format is a user comes to the page and is looking for a particular item. They can search, and then you highlight the search bar, and then they can click on the magnifying glass, et cetera, et cetera. So you also want to make sure that you're highlighting all the different states for your development team. So any states on that screen, like modals, any states with no data, error states, null states, non-happy path, right? You want to make sure that you can show that to the developers, right? So this takes some time, but it keeps the developers from missing anything. They don't have to click around the application, and they don't have to go finding them themselves. We'll also often duplicate interactions on a custom sidebar. So you can see it says the change states here. We will put something to the right of our designs, and then we will drag the interactions to that and use the documentation to allow you to kind of follow along. And it gives the developers a visual cue of the things on the page and what they're doing. It's also great for some of the things that UXPin can be a little finicky about letting you tag. So things like modals, hidden elements, and multi-states. So why do we do this? What are the benefits? Again, it's all for clarity's sake, right? It ensures that the devs can see all the nuanced interaction models they may have missed by just clicking around. Devs get a better sense of the product as a whole. They now know how the piece that they're working on fits into the greater picture. They're better able to offer feedback and suggestions on that because they're not working in a vacuum. It allows the devs to plan ahead before their sprints begin. So while we're designing sprint number 5, they can already be planning their work for sprint number 6 with a fair degree of certainty. It gives QA folks more contextual acceptance criteria. They aren't just checking boxes. They get to play around with a living product and understand how the pieces fit together. It creates a common language between devs and designers. The devs can air out their concerns and suggestions at a very early state, and that helps to minimize risk. And there have been plenty of instances where the development team has noticed something that would have otherwise gone missed by an information architect or the design team. So it provides that level of feedback early. It bakes in a level of user testing, so every person along the way has their hands on it and is commenting on how it will actually work, not a theoretical model of an idea in a requirements document. So people can now see it, feel it, taste it, touch it, and they can speak up if something feels funny, right? Also, some of the interactions can be very difficult to get right. So this sidebar allows you to explain any actions that may have required a little too much effort to actually prototype. You can you have to run a cost-benefit analysis to figure out the time that it takes to demonstrate something properly versus the benefit the client will get from actually seeing it. Sometimes you can fake it and annotate it, and if you do that properly, people will understand. Best practice number 5 is to reuse your components. What we've started doing to get to the medium fidelity very quickly is to create UI kits of our own to help drop things into prototypes and have them work right out of the gate. So what we've done is create our own quote-unquote unbranded UI kit. It's generic. It has black and white elements that we use all the time. And we've added a little bit of style to them, and makes it such that any member of our team can drag and drop them into any prototype, and these elements will work. We kept running into scenarios where 2 IAs were working on one prototype, and one with more design background had a little more subtle approaches to the way they handled information. So the more well-designed prototype had some visual hierarchy, some subtle color changes, overall just a little more polish. Whereas the other one would use just black and white text and some disjointed elements from UXPin's library. So clients would have a hard time picking up on why one part of the app was different from the other. And without any hierarchy in that less visually pleasing one, it was often hard for the client to discern what information they were supposed to focus on first. So we started small with a few items and put some basic styles on them. Again, just black and white and simple, just making them all consistent and clean. And then we continued to build, adding new elements and increasing the functionality. So many of the things are the same as the elements you can use straight out of UXPin's library. So I realize that that is a feature that UXPin provides. But we've taken a few things a little bit further. For example, we've created search bars and field inputs that you can start typing right away in, right? So you click and you're able to type right away. We were able to represent a Spotify style search to simulate type ahead. And we've added some kind of subtle niceties to things like tooltips that allow them to stay open when you hover into them. We've also done that for navigation that I don't think is native out of some of UXPin's libraries. It's nothing crazy complex, but the point is that we're building them once, and then we test them the same way that we would code, and then we add them to our own library of repeatable elements for people to come and grab. And it saves hours, if not probably days of time, especially if your team has varied skills with UXPin or whatever tool you're using. And one of the main benefits of this approach is that it ensures that everything going out the door has a certain amount of thought and polish on it, even in the early stages, regardless of whether a designer has touched it or not. So we also treat this UI kit as a product of ours. We have a backlog of suggestions and elements that we want to put into it. We have a loose release cycle that only happens after the elements have been tested. As a team, we suggest new elements and we prioritize what we need first. And one of us acts as a product owner, and then ultimately we decide what gets put in based on business value. So if somebody needs a bar chart that looks nice and adjusts when you click a button so the bars slide, we can build that and we can have that at the ready for showing a client and things like that. So we've managed to build some really cool stuff with UXPin library as a start. The benefits of having this UI kit have been plenty. It gets us out the gate faster. The first cut at something looks polished and professional, and it translates to the client as a perceived value. It also creates a client understanding very fast for that first round of prototypes, whereas it was not the case earlier. It translates very easily into a design language. We can take these files and begin to paint them with design and make them start to come to life very quickly. And anyone on the team, regardless of their level of knowledge of prototyping, of our prototyping tool, in this case, obviously UXPin, can come in and grab the elements and paste them in and know that they work. And then they don't have to restyle anything. They don't have to adjust the interactions. It just comes out of the box for them nicely. Of course, they're free to modify it, and they've been built in a fashion that is easy to modify. And we have a naming convention that tells people what they can delete, what they shouldn't, things like that. So if they want to modify it, they can, but it's not a necessity. So in that regard, it prevents lost momentum from having to create interactions when you're kind of in the zone building something else, right? It's easy to get caught up for some people about how they're going to make something work, and they're really worried about, I don't know how to make a slider. What do I do if I can't get that to work, right? So what this allows is for them to go and find something that's already been built and then drop it in, and they can just keep moving through building out their flows. So it's pretty obvious, but another benefit is just the time savings that we've created by having these elements. One person spends 2 hours creating an element, and then 10 other people don't have to spend the same 2 hours. Number 6 is to validate small builds often. The more you validate and the more you communicate, the more agile you can be. If you validate often, you don't wind up wasting too much time on things that aren't working. You can quickly find the things that are missing, and you keep yourself from going too far too fast because you can feel the app becoming unwieldy. There aren't really any hard and fast rules we have as to when to validate from a time perspective. You just don't want to go too long in between reviews. Send small pieces out once they're complete. What do I mean by complete? Simply that you can complete a task and you're not left stuck halfway in the middle of something. So sometimes it's easy to get halfway through a prototyping task and think the person will pick up on the rest, and oftentimes that's not the case. So making sure that you can go end to end and things like your data are correct at each step, that goes a long way in helping stakeholders understand. Also, breaking pieces out into their own microflows, if it helps. Sometimes you can try to do too much in these prototyping tools on one page, and it becomes too much to manage. It's important to remember, and I have to remind myself of this all the time, is that it's just a prototype and there are limits to what you can and should do. So this goes back to that Jira ticket example and starting to build things on their own pages and keeping things separate so that you don't, editing things doesn't become too crazy. So for the purpose of validation, if you have to leave an idea incomplete, walk through it in person so you can explain the missing pieces. Otherwise, you risk getting invalid feedback. When demoing to others, focus on the flows first, not the individual elements. Once you've demoed the flows, then you can work on the smaller interactions. Be careful to only demo when you have added clarity. Don't demo for the sake of a demo or because it's been X number of days since the last review. Wait until you have something valid to show and something useful to show, and then demo that. That keeps you from getting trapped and stuck with the product owner. It's easy to get excited and want to show a lot of cool stuff right from the start, even if it's not done, but don't leave those flows half complete and the user abandoned. You'll just add confusion. And then reference early reviews in later reviews. So use language like, remember we said, or the last time we were together. Those are just kind of simple, product management tips, I suppose. But also use the built-in tools that are in UXPin to handle comments, right? Use team comments where necessary. We do a lot of internal validation prior to sending to a client, and we try to validate often enough that any course correction only sets us back maybe a couple of hours and not days or weeks. So what have the results been like since we switched to this agile prototyping? Things just run smoother. We're able to spend a lot more time on the things that matter and spend less time dealing with the crap. As I mentioned earlier, literally everything that we design gets put into UXPin. Because we put everything in UXPin and manage the iterations within the tool, everyone is looking at the same version. So there's no risk of somebody opening the wrong PDF from the email last week instead of the most recent version, right? You don't have to resend files every time someone deletes an email. There's a common language between the client, the developers, and the designers. It's a much more team-oriented process for us. Now, everyone is in on the vision, and everyone can see it taking shape. And it seems like a small thing, but how many times has a client opened something and said, well, that's too small, and you know that it's not, right? So then you come to find out that they've been viewing it at 66% in Adobe Acrobat. So when we work in UXPin, everything is viewed at the correct size in the browser. There aren't any zooming issues. We can easily set breakpoints. We know that it will display reliably on the client's devices. And that's why we put our designs back into UXPin after the fact. We've seen much faster approval from clients. They just get it now. There aren't the same questions like we used to get. The questions are much more valid and focused on the solutions. They're not caught up in the deliverable. They're focused on those business solutions that we found. And they're actually appreciating the UX more and the design work that goes into their product. Again, that's that perceived value. The higher quality, there's also a higher quality and consistency of our work now due to this upfront clarity. So we're getting more and better work done with the time that we have, since less cycles are being wasted on petty crap. We're having better conversations with developers. They're taking more ownership, and there's a greater level of understanding in the products that we're creating. The comments and feedback are more easily managed. Everything happens in one platform. Prior to that, there were email threads that would make your head spin. And these feedback cycles are much faster, and the questions that we're getting are much better. As we've gotten better at following these practices, we're able to create extremely complex prototypes in a very short period of time. And this helps us add more value to our clients without blowing budgets and timelines. And it also facilitates deeper conversations with stakeholders because we're solving deeper business problems and bringing better solutions to the table. So overall, life is just easier with prototyping. So in summary, the 5 best practices to explore are to prototype in chunks. You're keeping track of your depth versus your breadth. Prioritize your use cases for prototyping. pace your fidelity, annotate your user flows, reuse your components, validate small builds often, and that's it. So again, I'd like to thank Jerry and the team over at UXPin for having me, and they've been great to work with. They're very responsive, and have been in contact with us regarding future enhancements. They've created Slack channels, as Jerry mentioned, for all sorts of various UX related topics, and they just have overall created a great community for everyone. So I'd also like to thank you guys for your time and for coming to listen to hang out. My hope is that some of you out there found some good knowledge nuggets and can take something back to your team. So if you're interested in seeing more of what we do or reading a little bit about what our knowledge base, there's some links here. You can go to lookthink.com or lookthink.com/blog. And I think we're going to open up the floor for some questions.
Yeah, great job, Nate. We got some great feedback here. We had over 1,200 people live, so really,
fantastic.
Yeah, really good turnout here. And before we dive into the Q&A, since we can't always get to all of the questions because we usually have like up to 100 questions per session, if people have more than 3 years of experience on a product team, check out our Slack team, Product Tribes. Nate's on there. Most of our speakers are all on there, and it's just just really a community of designers, developers, product managers. We've got almost 4,000 people now, thanks to the conference that we've done. So a lot of good conversations around everything product related, design, development, product management. So feel free to check that out. I will, of course, also put up our poll that we always launch at the end of the session because we usually have new people joining each session here. And let's get into the questions. We've got a lot of questions about process and tactics here. And so the first question here is really about workflow at LookThink. So knowing that you guys follow an agile process, how upstream or just ahead of the developers do you create prototypes, relative to what they are currently building? Are you guys trying to design a sprint ahead, 2 sprints ahead? Are you guys working in the same sprint on the designs?
Usually when we're working in a sprint base, which we try to as much as possible, we're working about a sprint ahead. So we are working, the information architects will be working with the product owners to come up with the solution and prototype it out. We'll pass that off to the development team as kind of a gut check. And then the development team will take a look at it, come back with their questions. We'll flesh those out. We'll get to a point where we agree upon what is basically MVP. And then we'll get that sign off and we'll say, okay, this is what we're agreeing to for next sprint. And then they will take that and create their own documentation and using UXPin and the prototype as a base. And then that's what they turn that into development and then the release of that version.
Gotcha. So it is kind of like the standard, agile workflow where you guys are working ahead. The next question we have here is about, let's see here. It's really about documentation. So, before you guys were delivering pretty heavy documentation, and now what would you say is like the common set of documentation that gets delivered to a client? You mentioned something about site maps. Of course, the prototypes. Is there anything else that gets delivered to the client during the design process?
From the design process, we will hand over style guides. And often some source documentation, some source files for sketch files for a handful of pages, right? Just so they can get a sense of how the things tie together. But usually it's UXPin. When we're working with, often the development team will go off and create their own documentation based on UXPin. So there's kind of the proposal, there's a set of requirement documents, there's UXPin, there's the documentation from UXPin, and then the developers will take and create their own development documentation based on that, along with design, style guides, and some mock-ups, and then that's kind of the package that goes over to create the final product.
Gotcha. going back to a question about workflow. So, you mentioned that you guys try to work ahead of the developers. How do you guys make sure that that whole process works? Since you guys are essentially working on a future state version, right? While the developers are working on more of like a current state. How do you guys just make that sort of communication flow and asset handoff just work smoothly?
Yeah, I guess the core of that question is that we make sure that we're finished with whatever we're prototyping by the time it gets handed to developers, so that we're not going back into the same prototype while they're doing the development, so that they don't get tripped up, right? So we'll do all of our kind of research and development so we're kind of iterating within an iteration, right? We're getting a quick prototype done, we're sending it to them, they're reviewing it, they're coming back with initial questions on the first cut, and then we do a second cut, we send that, and this is happening in Jira or Confluence, any of your typical kind of workflow tools. And then we get to a point where we say, okay, stop, and this is what you're taking. And then that ticket gets created from inside. That prototyping ticket goes to now being created as a development ticket. And then if we need to update anything, we create a new prototyping ticket and we prototype out anything new. And then that gets taken again then into a development ticket.
Gotcha. And the next question here is how does usability testing fit into this agile process over at LookThink? Maybe you could explain the sort of dynamic between the different types of prototypes you're creating and at which point user testing gets involved with those prototypes.
Yeah, there's always a certain amount of internal user testing that we're doing. So as we're creating these first versions, we are prototyping internally, and we're kind of gut checking with each other. And then as we start to add more detail, we continue to do that, and then we're user testing with the client. But then also, you have to get to a certain point with the prototype before you can actually just hand it to someone to click on everything, right? And oftentimes you don't have every interaction built out. So depending on the level of user testing we're trying to do will depend on the fidelity of the prototype. But usually we need to make sure that we've got enough built out that we can test some of the things that we need to, right? Like if we need to go from end to end on a flow, we need to just make sure that that's built out. And then, we have the facilitator kind of write the scripts such that we stay within the boundaries of that and don't go outside into a part of the application that isn't developed yet or prototyped yet, rather.
Right. And going back to the prototyping process, so a person here saying that usually it's a goal for the hi-fi prototype to kind of evolve from the lo-fi interactive prototype and retain as much of that interactivity as possible. It seems like the process that you guys are following kind of splits out the lo-fi and the hi-fi prototype over the life of a project. Would you say that has created any, or would you say that you guys encountered any roadblocks that made a single prototype just not feasible?
So we're working towards, and you guys, UXPin has really been working towards being able to take those lo-fi into hi-fi with some of the new releases. Some of this stuff were projects from a while ago where that really wasn't an option. So we're trying to make it such that the UI kit is helping us to be able to kind of paint that lo-fi and turn it into hi-fi as we move, so that we retain some of those interactions. But sometimes there's just, we create, very complex business applications, and sometimes there's just the reason that we pull back some of the design is because sometimes it just gets unwieldy to manage all the interactions and all the things that are showing and hiding, and trying to build in the logic of a handful of tabs and different inputs and things like that. So what we try to do is, because we've shown the client and it really only works when the client has seen the other prototypes, right? So if they're only seeing the designed prototype, it's not going to fly, right? Because they're going to have some questions. But if they've been seeing the prototype all throughout the process, and then you step back some of the functionality and show the design, they generally understand what they're looking at. It's like, oh, okay, I click on that, and then we're just using show and hide, right? And we're just using some of the more simple interactions instead of trying to build out hugely complex prototypes, if that makes sense.
Right. And we've had a couple questions around, this has actually been a theme of questions, which is, how did you guys ultimately end up deciding using UXN over, say, Axure, InVision, or even going with HTML prototyping? What was some of the trigger that made you guys decide that this was right for the agency?
It kind of hit the sweet spot of a low barrier of entry. It had just enough design. It had had just enough interactions. I think the two front runners, to be perfectly honest, I think it came down to Proto.io and UXPin, and I think we wound up going with UXPin. There were a handful, I can't remember the features off the top of my head, but we wound up liking UXPin better. We have done HTML prototyping. We've tried that. Ultimately, it was, if you have somebody that doesn't know HTML, or if you have somebody that is, there's still a barrier of entry to that, right? And if you want to start doing something very complex, you need to build that knowledge base up from the ground up instead of having the tool be what's guiding that. So Axure and let's see, some of the other ones, I don't have a lot of experience with those, but one of the people on our staff, they mentioned that there's a lot you can do with it, but eventually it starts to get too much, right? It starts to get too crazy, and at that point you're basically building an application anyway. So UXPIM was kind of that sweet spot of simplicity, but going deep enough that when we need the complexity, we can go and get it, but not having to have it straight off the bat.
Right. Yeah, and going back, yeah, that's actually a really helpful sort of explanation. Going back to a prototyping flow question. So someone here is curious, just the way that you do things. So how do you usually approach prototyping different forks of flows? So for instance, if a submit button is going to have two flows, right? One is going to lead you to a confirmation message, and the other one is going to lead you to an error state. Would that be two different prototypes for you, or how would you approach something like that?
One is going to take you to we'll often do that either depending on what you need to do. We can often do it with modals. So one will pull up one modal, one will pull up another modal. If you're talking about needing two different outcomes when you go to a separate page, we will sometimes build those things out as separate pages in UXPin, even though it's maybe the same page that you're on, but the content underneath modal is changing. So that's one way to handle it. It's a little jumpy, but it gets the point across better, and it's easier to manage than trying to build the entire situation in one page, right? So it's not two different prototypes, but oftentimes it's two different pages with different outcomes on each.
Right. And going up, one more level, generally what flows do you prototype for? So for instance, do you create an inventory of all the possible flows and use cases and then develop a short list that you will prototype, or what is that process to, going from all the possible user flows down to just the ones you want to prototype? What does that look like?
Oftentimes we're doing all of them. And I like to have all of them available, even if they're not kind of mocked up, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like you just put a box on a page and then you're linking out like the things that could happen on that page. You're just kind of putting links in to get you to that page and then out of that page. I find that helps people from getting tripped up. We oftentimes are doing all of them. I'm not sure I have a great answer for that. Can you give me, Jerry, can you give me that person's, maybe that person's Slack handle and I can try to get a hold of them?
Yeah, you know what might be better is actually I'm gonna put your email in this chat here, and if people have direct questions, they can feel free to I guess reach out to you here.
Yeah, I'd love that.
Yep, because yeah, that way that person can just reach out to you directly. And the next question here is really about. Let's see, I had this pulled up here. All right, here we go. Here's the question. So, obviously Jira integration is something that's on the UXPin roadmap, but they're curious right now for you guys, how do you work with prototypes in Jira? And maybe you could talk a little bit more about how the Jira and the prototyping workflow looks like.
Yeah. So we will, we'll write a ticket for a ticket for the feature, and then as I mentioned, the current example that I'm using a lot is something that we've been prototyping now for a couple of years, and it's gotten huge, right? So now when we go back into it and we're prototyping out smaller features, we've pretty much abandoned the main prototype because everybody knows what's going on with that. And now we have kind of our own pages for these kind of micro flows and these new features. So what I'll generally do is create a new page and name it after the Jira ticket, and then link that up into Jira. And then I think what I've seen kind of you guys as beta, I think what, ideally we would like it so that you can kind of connect comments to parts of the Jira ticket and be able to kind of have that go back and forth between the Jira ticket and pieces of the documentation on the UX pin. But currently we just use a link. I forget what they're called in Jira, but I think it's called links. So we use an external link to the UX pin, and we put that link in Confluence, and then we tell them to check the comments. We'll put something like, be sure to check the comments or use the documentation tab to refer to whatever. But it's fairly straightforward. It's not super complex as far as just saying here is what's happening in UX pin, but then it was a big step for us to kind of say this is too complex to build within the context of the rest of the application. We're going to break this piece out. Just understand that it's going in this part of this page, right? So that clarity of here's where this exists. This isn't its own thing. This is part of something else. And then building that flow separate of the rest of the prototype. We've started doing that quite a bit.
Right. And there's been a couple questions here about how you deal with iterations and revisiting a prototype after the first pass. Could you talk about what that workflow looks like for you guys? So when you go and create a new iteration, and then how do you handle comments and really just version control?
Yeah, we've used iterations within UXPin as it kind of depends on, again, because of the way that we work, it kind of depends on the client. It kind of depends on the type of feedback we're getting. We've used iterations in UXPin. The one time that we got burned by that, we had to revert back to a previous iteration, and then all of the links within our Jira ticket no longer worked because the URLs have changed. So what we tend to do is save a new version and then name that basically the older version, and then work on the same link that we sent out so that the link stays the same, but we're basically working in a new version. So it's, you save the version, you name that one, you name the new one version 2, and then you move forward like that. And then if you need to go back and view the other previous iterations, you can kind of see what decisions were made, and you can carry over all the comments from version to version. And that's been pretty safe for us.
Right.
Versus using and I realize that UXPin has version control built in the iterations. It was just that one time when we had to revert. It's harder to revert back, because I don't think there's a revert with copy, right? So if you could revert back and create a new version from that that revert, then we might use it. But we
Right.
tend to copy the project, or the, I guess, the project. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that you mentioned, with version control in Jira, that is something that we'll have to work on for, of course, for the Jira integration, right? Because when the URLs change, that affects how things are tracked in Jira. The next question here is going back to that UI kit you were talking about. So does that UI kit have mobile components, or is it mostly desktop components right now?
It's mostly desktop right now. We haven't gotten into mobile, but it's on our roadmap.
Yeah, got it. So the next question here is, let's see. So have you ever been in a situation where QA looks at prototypes in too much detail when they're not supposed to be, perfect spec deliverables? And if so, how do you get them to focus on QAing the right portions of a prototype?
It's a good question. So how do we get them? Usually we have to send over some kind of like QA spec. So we'll send them, we'll either send over the pages that need to be QA'd. We're not really expecting kind of pixel perfectness out of the UX pin often. Sometimes that we want that to come from the actual sketch document. When it's our developer, we have we're a fairly small team, and we work in a big single room, so we can go and get in his ear when we see something that's not right. So it's yeah, I haven't really run into situations where that's happened, where they've been like, well, this looks like this here and this doesn't look like this there. We usually will tell them that we'll specify the pieces that are for review, and sometimes we've done things where we have made a layer that toggles on top of things that basically puts a mask over anything we don't want them to review. That's one way that we've kind of worked around, giving that documentation. So basically you hit a button and then a giant pink mask shows up on anything that doesn't need to get reviewed and says do not review. And then that way they can turn it off and still use the application, but they can see what they're responsible for reviewing. Is one way we've done that.
Gotcha. Let's find the next question here. So someone here mentioned that it sounds like you guys are following, the Agile and more specifically a Scrum methodology. And they're wondering if you could give a better idea of how the design team actually shares and communicates the prototypes with clients and stakeholders. So for instance, does a project manager manage that whole communication flow? Do you need to have separate stakeholders separate meetings with stakeholders to review? I think they're really curious about overall the review and approval process between the team and also with the outside clients.
Yeah. So generally, we'll start working on, the information architects will be working on building out the prototypes, and then the design team will be kind of having separate. We'll have a kickoff meeting, and we'll decide on any branding limitations and design specs and things like that at a very high level. And then the information architects will take off and do their thing, and they'll start creating the prototype and sitemap prototype, etc. And then the design team will kind of be building a branding document or a style tile. We use a lot of style tiles, and they'll start to kind of get a sense of where the design will go. And then at some point, it's not always the same, but at some point we get to a point where we say, okay, designers, you are now able to start building out the kind of UI kit for this product, right? Like we've got a good enough, the prototype is good enough and baked. You can see all the elements that are in there. We're still finagling some things and trying to figure out what we're doing with a few things, but you can now take this from a design standpoint and start building out kind of a UI kit. that will then be handed off to developers at the end. They have that kit, and then they also will use it to rebuild the design itself, right? So they'll take all the form elements and they'll take all the buttons and all the icons, and then they'll start laying out designs, right? So we tend to we try not to lay out every page, right? Because that gets huge, right? So we lay out a couple of pages, usually a home page. We try to get any pages that have the most amount of data, pages that have the most amount of stuff in it. We try to take care of those so that the client can see everything. They get a better sense of how all the different things tie together. So you don't want to take the most blank page and do that one, right? That they won't. There's not enough there, right? So we try to take as much as we can and give them as much as they can get for a total view. And then once we get sign off on that, we hand over the UI kit, the prototype, any source documents to the developers, and then they start to assemble the pieces from all of that. They in a kind of atomic design fashion, right? So they're taking the pieces and assembling them based on the guidelines that we've given them. And then what we do is a round of QA based on that first development cut. And then there's usually another kind of design pass that happens to fill in any blanks that the development team has come back and said, hey, I don't have the pieces for this. Can you provide me with, such and such?
Right. And then and now looking back at sort of communication and workflow, right? We just covered off on how you interact with stakeholders and with clients. Someone's also curious about how you interact with developers. So this is sort of a two-part question, which is, and the first part is your development team local, or do you work with any remote developers? And the second part is, how do you then collaborate with the developers? So what sort of documentation and assets do you provide them so that they can accurately implement your work?
So the answer to the first question is yes. Sometimes we're working with our development team. Sometimes we're not working with our development team. Sometimes when we're working with our development team, they are local. When we are working with other development teams, they are scattered. We have one foreign team. I've seen some questions about global teams. That's the team that is on some of these projects that have been referenced in here. So that's the one that we're doing a lot of Jira integration with, and we're vetting things very early, right? So meetings with the product owner are happening, and there's just a lot of open dialogue. There's a lot of, hey, this is what I'm thinking of doing. Do you see any problems with that? Nope, that sounds good. Okay, cool. I'm going to put this together. You put a first round of prototypes together and you explain what they're seeing. We put together videos. I just put together a video the other day of clicking through a prototype to explain it. And then when you're working with remote teams, that helps clear up a lot of confusion. So you just open up QuickTime and explain what you're showing. Sometimes that saves having to write out documentation in UXPin. What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry. What kind of documentation
Yeah, what documentation and assets do you provide the developers, and just what does that kind of handoff process look like for you guys?
Yeah, so that's the sketch files, the UI kit that we've put together. So we put together here's what form elements will look like. Here's what buttons will look like. Here's what icons will look like. Any kind of SVGs or imagery that we have, we put that together for them. We have the prototype, and then usually there's some sort of spec document that we started with that they receive as well, so that they can verify that everything is kind of matching up.
Right. And the next question that we have, and this will be the last question, and the conversation continues, of course, in Product Tribes, which is the Slack team. So if you have more than 3 years of experience, go ahead and apply. And for the folks here, if you're curious and are interested in just checking out UXPin, you can also check out our website there. And we will take the last question now. So last question we have is really about just how the UX team is structured at LookThink. So are most of them specialists, or do people work across do people work across different functionalities within design, or maybe even outside of design?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think we're fairly unique in that regard. And I think half of our development team started in design. A handful of our information architects started in design. We have a product manager who's now kind of moved into the world of information architecture. So we all wear different hats and we all share different roles. And we kind of pride ourselves on that. We're very capable of kind of filling in the gaps. We're not big enough, and we don't have the luxury of being absolute specialists. So for better or for worse, we are doing a little bit of everything. And I think that gives us some good perspective on kind of other people's roles, right? So if you've done a little bit of development, you know how to better speak with the developer, and you know their concerns. You understand what they're looking for, and when they push back, you understand how to ask the right questions to get the answers. So we definitely share a lot of different roles, and not everybody started in design. I think the question was specifically around design, but we have a couple of information architects who have some design background. We have a designer who does a lot of information architecture as well. But a couple of our information architects have no design background. So that was partially some of the impetus for creating that UI kit and making it such that everything has that level of design polish.
Right. Yeah, that is actually a really cool team structure. It sounds like some people at some point in their work, either at LookThink or elsewhere, have sort of crossed between the design and development realm, right? And that's always helpful in terms of collaboration and just information sharing. That is the end of the session here, guys. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. It was great seeing all these fantastic questions. And
thank you so much. This has been great.
Yeah, no, thank you, Nate. This was a great session.
Hey, Jerry, is there a way to archive these questions? Can I get
Yeah, I can send you the Q&A for this afterwards. That's not a problem.
That would be awesome. I'd appreciate it.
And for folks here, if you're curious, and the next session that we have during this lunch hour is going to be a pure UXPin product demo. So we're going to have Lindsay from our customer team here talking about how UXPin helps with an agile process. So if you're curious at all about how the platform performs in terms of creating an agile design process, I've dropped the link here, and I'm going to be hopping off to start that session now. And after that, we've got some more afternoon sessions with folks. We'll be talking about bringing empathy to agile teams, and also looking at a case study of how to use design spikes as part of the agile process. And so we've got Indy Young and Damon Dimmick in the afternoon there. And hope to see everybody there. Yeah, Nate, have a great rest of the day, man. This was
thank you. You too. Thanks, guys.
All right, take care.
Have a good one.